Hello and welcome to Say Hi to the Future, Ingenious Thinkers, a podcast aimed at highlighting the human side of ingenuity. My name is Ken Tencer, curator of Say Hi to the Future, helping leaders think differently in the face of uncertainty and ambiguity. Better thinking, better outcomes.
With me today is Jerry Toth, co-founder of the Third Millennium Alliance, a nonprofit conservation organization that is working to preserve and restore the most endangered rainforests on Earth. Like this video if you enjoy our show and subscribe to our channel. Leave us a comment with who we should interview next. Thank you for tuning in, and I hope you enjoy the show. Jerry Toth, welcome to Say Hi to the Future.
Thanks for having me.
So Jerry, it says rainforest conservationist, chocolate entrepreneur, and independent filmmaker based in Ecuador. So what comes first? How did it happen? That's a lot of stuff.
Yeah, it is. I guess I've been living and working in South America for the past over 20 years now. And my life as it is now kind of combines all the things that I really care about. Rainforest conservation. I do make chocolate. I do make films. And I've, to some extent, found a way to wrap all those things together. Not it doesn't fit perfectly well, but those are my interests in life and also my interests in work.
So one, it's wonderful that you've been able to blend them together. I mean, passion and curiosity and when you blend that with things that are important, to yourself and to the world around you, one, that's awesome. So kudos on that. Where does it start though? Like, any one of those has to start from some, is it a moment? Is it a passion? Like, why you?
Yeah, well, so I right after I graduated from university, my very first job was working on Wall Street, of all places, in New York City, in investment banking. And I knew kind of from the outset that I didn't want to be doing that even before I started. I had this sense I was doing it because I felt like this was the next step in the logical progression of a successful life. You study hard, you get good grades, you go to the university that's a good university, you get the good job, you get married, you have kids, you die, and then that's it. And
fertile earth, Jerry.
Yeah, right. And I just didn't really I didn't want that, and I didn't realize that until I was actually kind of somewhat on that path, and I felt called to leave the urban jungle and go to South America, go to warmer, wilder places, and figure out what I wanted to do there. I wanted to spend it. Basically, it started out as simply as wanting to spend most of my time outside, find a job that I could really do for the most part in fresh air. And so that's what triggered me to leave that earlier version of my life. And I did it young. I mean, I was only in New York for 1 year and left when I believe I was 23. And that began a period of living and working in many different countries in South America, in Central America. And after a few years of that, kind of starting to hone my interests, I eventually settled on Ecuador and wanted to put down roots in a country, and really also put down roots in a project and start getting to work on something more meaningful. I'd previously worked as a journalist for a while, actually for a Canadian magazine, Adbusters, which is out of Vancouver. But that magazine brought us in contact with the concept of sustainable development and certain methods of sustainable development, specifically permaculture. And I was in Ecuador with two other people that became the co-founders of Third Millennium Alliance, or TMA as we call it. And we wanted to kind of put our money where our mouth is, in a sense, or we wanted to get involved in these concepts that we were talking about and interested in. We wanted to actually apply them, and we wanted to apply them in a specific place. We wanted to practice what we preached, in a sense, and we wanted to see if we could kickstart a new development path in a certain region in Ecuador that had been really ravaged in the past 80 years through deforestation and agricultural expansion. It was reaching a tipping point. It's this really special ecosystem, the Pacific Forest of Ecuador, that much of it had been lost, and it was headed in the wrong direction. And we felt that if we could have an impact in this specific area, that would be a big victory for Ecuador, for ecology, and I think it maybe set an example for what could be done in other parts of the world. And so we just kind of planted a flag in the middle of this rainforest, and with the impetus to do what we could to protect what was there and restore what's already been lost, and to do it with the people that were living in the area, and to do it in the most constructive way possible, aligning economic incentives with conservation goals. And so that's what we've been doing for the better part of the last 15 years. And the chocolate company grew out of that, and then filmmaking grew out of that as well. And so here we are.
Thank you for sharing that, Jerry. And so just explain to me, still on landing in Ecuador and finding this specific project or emphasis of your life, a lot of forces going on there. Like when you get to Ecuador, I mean, you say you plant a flag, but there's got to be government impetus or regulation or decision making involved in what you can and cannot chop down. There's got to be huge business involved with the profit motive in the area. So from planting a flag, like, just walk me through how that works, how you take your first steps.
Yeah, so the area that we work in now, and that is now a protected area called the Hamacoake Forest Preserve, which currently protects 2,500 acres. We initially started by purchasing a 100-acre property at the very top of this mountain, and it was we came upon it, and somewhat by happenstance happened to meet the grown son of a man that was selling the property. He knew that we were conservationists in search of a project, and he offered to take us to his father's land. He said, it's this really special property. It has cloud forest, it has all these waterfalls, it has 3 different rivers are born in this property. And it all sounded a bit too good to be true, but we took him up on it, and we were up for an adventure. And we saw the land, and we had this moment of we arrived, and on the drive there, you really are driving through, for the most part, just miles and miles and miles of cattle pasture in land that's already been deforested. And you almost get the sense that, is there really any forest here? It didn't seem like there was. And eventually then we broke off the main road and started driving inland. And you can see way in the distance this mountain range. It's almost perpetually covered by fog, far in the distance. And as we got closer, sure enough, we realized we were at the gates of this massive forested mountain range. And it's kind of hidden. A lot of people, even in the province itself, don't know that it exists. And we hiked all the way up through the forest up to the top of that mountain. It is a long journey. And we got to the top, and sometimes there's days, because it's almost always shrouded in clouds, where you don't get a good view. But on that particular day, we got lucky, and there was the clouds, the fog had cleared a bit, and there was enough of a little peek hole through the forest that you could look out, and we realized that we were kind of in this island of green, an island of biodiversity surrounded by a sea of cattle pasture. And there was a very real sense that this is a place that this is a very special part of our planet, and it is most likely not going to exist in 10 years if something's not done. And so that's where we started. We We raised money through friends and family to purchase 100 acres. It was $16,000 US at the time, and from there we just spent a lot of time living in that forest. Actually, we camped in that forest. We pitched tents. We lived there. We made friends with our neighbors. We learned as much as we could about the area. We met all the other landowners that lived in the area. Most of the landowners actually didn't live in the area. Most of that land was owned by absentee owners that in some cases had just inherited the properties from these massive land holdings from other their parents or grandparents, had never visited their properties. It was this kind of abandoned forest. And every now and again, one of the members of that family would sell off a piece, and that piece would be promptly cleared for cattle ranching, and the agricultural frontier kept moving up the mountains slowly but surely. We had seen this in other parts of the region where that line of agriculture just kept moving up the mountain until it reached the top of the mountain. And then at that point, the forest was lost, the rivers would eventually run dry, and the early stages of desertification would begin. This is a pattern that had been taking place throughout the province, and in this particular area, it hadn't yet. And so we purchased that property, and we started to figure out what to do about this. And that it wasn't, to your initial question, it wasn't so much about corporations that were developing land. It wasn't so much about what the government was doing. The government really wasn't doing anything. There was no oversight really whatsoever. It was more about what local landholders were doing, what small scale farmers were doing just to make a living, and what cattle ranchers were doing. And so it was really engaging with the communities around the area that was the first and foremost on our mind, and still is to this day.
Even more so, maybe if these small landowners are doing this to make a living, to feed their family, or how do they decide not to? What is selling that profitable? What do they do after? Like, what is the whole sort of continuation, if you will?
Yeah, and that right there, that is the $1 trillion question. That is the question that, if we as humanity want to solve the deforestation problem, that's the question at the heart of it. How can we align economic interests with preserving forests? And so we initially didn't have that answer. We tried on a bunch of different solutions, and there are solutions floating around out there. There's kind of a few general tactics that conservationists will try to employ. I mean, ecotourism is a common alternative. The approach that we really found to be the most useful is shade-grown cacao. And so cultivating cacao trees in the shade of the forest, whether that's a cultivated forest or a secondary growth forest, but farming cacao trees and other fruit producing crops in a forest setting. So in other words, regenerative agroforestry.
Okay.
That to us was the most promising solution. And so this region, people already had a history of cultivating cacao. They had largely abandoned it because prices were so low and it was no longer generating a profit for them. Okay. So part of it was the task of how can we improve the prices that farmers are paid for cultivating cacao? How can we tie those high prices to biodiversity metrics? For example, it's not just about producing cacao and purchasing the cacao from those farms, but it's ensuring that the cacao is grown in a forest setting. It is grown beneath the shade of taller trees with a certain degree of biodiversity, and connecting those farmers with high-paying chocolate companies that are whose customers themselves also want to support forest restoration rather than deforestation, and try to kind of close that gap and put all those pieces together so that it's all working together. You have farmers who are cultivating shade-grown cacao. You have chocolate companies who are paying a premium for cacao that's grown in the shade, and we're kind of marrying those two elements to create a project that works for all parties.
This is fascinating to me. You have deforestation and you keep talking about shade grown cacao. Where does the shade come from? How do you redevelop or reforest an area to make this viable?
Yeah, so that is a good question. A lot of the properties that we're trying to restore are land that had been cleared years ago, in most cases decades ago, initially logged and then slashed and burned to grow a few years of corn, and then probably converted to cattle pasture. And so so that is land that was formerly forest that was converted to either monoculture corn or monoculture pasture grass. How do we reconvert that back to forest through cacao? And the design that we came upon, and we've been cultivating cacao and testing different agroforestry designs for many years. We created this design that tries to optimize biodiversity of trees, productivity of the crops grown, and yield that farmers can earn. And so we have this I guess a menu of options where farmers can grow. The ideal design is 100 shade trees per hectare, planted at 10-meter spacing, so across 15 different species, mostly combination of native hardwood species, tall fruit trees. And so they kind of, the 10 by 10 is that you could think of that as the architecture of their parcel. And this isn't cacao trees. These are trees that are going to grow up and mimic the structure and the canopy of a forest. Okay. And then in between those trees, they plant also line of banana trees, banana plants, and then also lines of cacao trees. And so you have cacao and banana growing up below, alongside these other trees. And in the first few years, everything is kind of coming up together. And so you look at it in 2 or 3 years, and it's not shade grown cacao yet. It's cacao that's grown in the shade of banana plants. The banana plants grow really quickly and establish shade within the first year. Meanwhile, the taller trees, the timber trees, the tall fruit trees like avocados, mangoes, breadfruit, jackfruit, those continue to grow. And over time, you have this forest that grows up and eventually reaches heights of 30 meters, 25 meters. Below that, you have these a bunch of 3-meter cacao trees that when you do a drone flyover or take satellite imagery of, you don't really see those trees in the understory. You see these large overstory trees, and you look to the naked eye, it looks like a forest. You'd walk through and say, oh, this is a forest. If you pay attention, you can see, okay, yeah, there's some intentional spacing here. If you identify these species and you also recognize the fact that, wow, there's also a lot of food producing trees in this forest, but it's effectively mimicking the structure of a forest. But the difference is that what this forest produces is food for local food security, habitat for wildlife, and income for farmers.
Okay. So and that's where I was going to go next, was understanding the economics and outcomes. So is it a whole group of interconnected micro farms, if you will? I mean, are you acquiring or whatever, building more of your own land? Is it 100 family farms?
Yeah, so these are all family farms. So this is land owned by our neighbors and these farmers that are interested in participating in the program. And it's a network of all these different farm parcels when you look at a map of it. And for the most part, we try to work with farmers that live and work in the buffer zone that surrounds the protected area, the kind of the native forest. Is you go from the very top of the mountain and you start, where the true stands of primary growth and mature secondary growth forests are at the top. As you start going down the mountain range, you start to get into degraded forest, and you start to get into patches of land that have been cleared for cattle ranching. You continue going down, and eventually, you're halfway down the mountain, and then most of the land is deforested. By the time you get to the bottom of the mountain, everything is deforested. And so cacao is best suited for actually that mid-elevational buffer zone band. That's just where the water conditions tend to be the best. And it's also the most ripe for restoration. And so we try to work with farmers in that area. And the criteria is first and foremost people that want to participate, people that are looking for an alternative, people that can sense that this is going to be good economically for them. And in some communities, do they have irrigation access? Do they have the ability to? And that's part of our program. We help people set up gravity-fed irrigation systems. We provide all the seedlings necessary, all the fencing necessary, mechanical weed whackers. And the key component, which I think was the real game changer for us, because an earlier iteration of this project combined much of that, but lacked the feature of bridge payments. And so when we would propose this idea in the past, we would say, this is, you will earn more money cultivating cacao than you are cattle ranching. And they'd say, yes, but I have cows right now. It'll take me a few years to get those cacao trees up and running. So I can't just wait for 5 years until I earn income, which is a fair point. And so what we do is we calculate the amount of money that farmers will be earning when they're officially up and running. And it takes cacao trees. A precocious cacao tree can produce its first pod in 3 years, but it doesn't really hit, it doesn't become really productive until year 5. So we calculate what that income stream would be. We agree to pay the farmer that starting in day 1. So monthly payments automatically debited to their account every single month in exchange for the service of restoring the forest on their land. And so there is a carbon calculation that can be made, and we equate this to a carbon benefit, because that's the way that the world loves to kind of monetize ecosystem services. In a sense, we are paying these service providers for planting trees, for reforesting land. They get payments for 5 years until their cacao trees start producing revenue, and then they get access to these extremely high-paying markets. One of which is the chocolate company Toth, which is a company that I also co-founded, and is kind of known for the most expensive chocolate in the world, and also is known for paying farmers the highest prices in the world. And so that's the key element there. They get access to this super high-paying market. In the meantime, they get paid monthly payments and to kind of bridge that gap. And they also get starting in year 1, because banana is a staple crop in the area. They're producing a tremendous amount of food for their families, and that they can also sell. So it's kind of trying to bring everything together into the same package.
Chocolate. What makes some chocolate the most expensive in the world and others quite a bit less so? What are you really doing there that is created? I mean, you're written up in Smithsonian Magazine about what you're doing, as well as many, many others. So how have you sort of captured the imagination of so many people in the world?
Yeah, well, there's an amazing story behind the cacao that we use. The cacao has been used by humans for what we know by archaeological evidence, at least 5,300 years, dating back to this obviously pre-Columbian civilization, the Machu Picchu in Ecuador. So Ecuador is, as far as we as humans know at this point, the beginning of the humans' relationship with cacao. So you have this really long history in Ecuador specifically. You have this really special variety called Nacional. Cacao, just like wine, wine varieties, we have Pinot Noir, Merlot, Cabernet Sauvignon, Chardonnay. Cacao, we also have varieties, one of which is called Nacional. The origins of Nacional still aren't fully known, but we know that it was the dominant cacao variety in coastal Ecuador when by the time Europeans first arrived, that was already well established there. And over the next few hundred years, cacao had been migrating to other parts of the world for a few thousand of years. It reached Central America, it reached southern Mexico, and then of course, in the 1700s, it migrated to Africa and Asia and the tropics. But Ecuadorian cacao was always kind of the creme de la creme. It was the favored cacao source for chocolate makers in Europe specifically. And so in the 1800s, it was the highest priced variety in the world. It was prized for its floral aroma, for its complex flavor profile, although they didn't use those terms then. Those are the bougie wine terms we use now, but that was what they were going for. And in about and cacao at the time was Ecuador's biggest industry. That's cacao is what built Ecuador's biggest city. And so by 1916, a disease arrived there are two diseases back to back, witch's broom and frosty pod disease, that arrived within about 3 years of each other, around 1916 to 1920, that time. And it decimated this specific variety. In the wake of that, seeds from other parts of the world were brought in. So non-Ecuadorian cacao seeds, non-nacional seeds were brought in, started to interbreed with cacao that was there. And fast forward 100 years later, and Nacional cacao in its purest form had basically disappeared. It was believed to be extinct. There was a valley in the northeastern corner of Peru that neighbors Ecuador, where some of these trees had been found. And then we believed that we had found another source of these trees, because they were much older than 100 years old, had all the characteristics. We contacted the USDA genetic lab, which was the foremost, and still is, them along with another genetic lab in Trinidad, the two foremost cacao genetics labs in the world. They tested leaf samples from these trees and were able to determine that in fact this was pure Nacional, which they called ancient Nacional cacao. And so in Ecuador, it was the only known valley that had this. And that kickstarted the chocolate project that I had started with a few other people, called Toac Chocolate. Suddenly we had this kind of exclusive access to this famed source of cacao, and we created a brand around it. We and not going beyond simply the genetics of the cacao, we packaged chocolate the way that wine is packaged. We to a certain extent, we rather than bottles, of course, we made these really finely handcrafted wooden boxes that come with a wooden tasting utensil, that come with a 115-page booklet, and try to really celebrate cacao as something, and chocolate as something really on the level of the finest wines and whiskeys that you can find, as opposed to just the candy bars of our childhood. We wanted to really kind of flip that paradigm on its head, with the consequence being that if customers out there are willing to pay much more for chocolate, then accordingly, those chocolate companies can pay cacao growers much more for their cacao. And then you can kind of flip the paradigm in terms of how cacao is farmed. And so that was the first step in this process that we are now kind of coming full circle on.
So in this whole story we've heard, or that you've discussed in the last 30 minutes or so, you're giving rise to a whole economic model for a region. Is this something that can be replicated? Is this something that has been, or because it's obviously so brilliantly thought through the way that you tell it. And hey, as an entrepreneur, I know you probably it may sound more brilliant than it was at the time, but the essence of what you've done is so incredibly well thought through, step by step. How do you replicate, or do you?
Yeah, well, so we started piloting this project in just a single community, and it really it took off so quickly that we started expanding to a few more communities, and we are now, I think, at 6 different communities, and we continue to grow. And so throughout the area we work in it's the ecosystem is called the Pacific Forest of Ecuador, but specifically it's the Capuchin Corridor, which is where we're conducting this program. And it's a conservation corridor that connects the last kind of all the protected areas along this mountain range. And so currently it's limited to the Capuchin Corridor, this project and this cacao genetics. I think that it's possible that this specific program could be replicated to other parts of Ecuador. I think more broadly, what could be replicated to other parts of the tropics is this model of, and it's not a new concept to try to grow a very high value non-timber forest product and use that as the linchpin of a conservation project. But what is lacking, I think, is actually real examples of that really working. And you look around, you hear this, it's like one of those concepts that works on paper, and you're like, all right, well, who's doing it? And there aren't many examples of that in the world, and we want it to be one. We want to be the example that people can say, hey, did you hear what they're doing in Ecuador with cacao? Let's do that with cloves in Africa. Let's do that. And, there's efforts to do that with coffee in Colombia. And I think there's a lot of promise for it. I think it's part of that is convincing, is finding a product that consumers are willing to pay a premium for, and that they understand why they're paying that premium. It's not just to enrich the owner of whatever product is being sold, but there's a whole supply chain there, and that's just the end stop of it. And so part of it's just consumer awareness, and part of it is finding the right, not just the right product market fit, but also the product farmer fit, and to use that and to leverage it, and to see if we can do that in other parts of the world. And this is just, we're doing it in Ecuador, and we hope that we inspire other projects like this in other parts of the world.
Well, Jerry Toth, co-founder of Third Millennium Alliance. It's been fascinating. And thank you so much for joining us on Say Hi to the Future. And what an incredible story, what an incredible life journey you've had and you continue to have. And thank you for all your work. And we hope that we can share this out and have some small impact on what you're doing.
Thanks, Ken. It's been great. Thanks for having me.